For the sake of the story, we'll call this teacher Mr. Alberts. Mr. Alberts was one of those teachers that everybody knew, and he seemed to know everybody back. Everyone called him by his first name, and he seemed to have the talent of calling everyone else by the first name, even if they were students that weren't even in his class. Well, the day came when somebody had given me a note at the door to hand Mr. Alberts. They were in a hurry, and they told me to give it to him, since they figured I knew him like everybody else does. So, when I went to find his classroom, it occurred to me that I didn't even know what he taught. Coming to think of it, I had never even seen him teaching in a classroom. I had a few minutes before it was time for school to start, so I went up to the first teacher I saw, and I asked him where Mr. Albert's classroom was. He looked at me, blinked a few times, seemingly confused. Apparently, he did not know where Mr. Albert's classroom was either, but he wasn't going to admit it to me as a child. The teacher asked why I was looking for his classroom, and I told him that I had a note to deliver to him. The teacher took the note from me and stepped into a neighboring classroom. Even though I couldn't hear what he was saying, I knew that he was asking the other teacher where Mr. Albert's classroom was, making up some excuse, like it seemed to have slipped his mind. The other teacher gave him a strange look that he gave me. It seemed most strange that the most popular teacher in the entire elementary school was a mystery as to what he taught and where he taught it. It wasn't too hard to see him wandering the halls. Come to think of it, that was the only time I ever saw him. He was either on his way to the bathroom, or on his way to the office, or checking something out on the information board. It wasn't more than 5 minutes of walking around the hallway that I finally saw him. He had his back to me, so he didn't see me. I called out to him, but he didn't seem to hear me either. I followed him. He was able to cover long distances in a single stride, and me, with my little third-grade legs, I had a hard time keeping up. If I'd gotten his attention, I might not have seen what I saw next. I don't know what made me choose to keep quiet as I approached him, but I was a few paces away from him when he entered a bathroom, and he glanced inside and then shut the door behind him, which was peculiar because the only time that happens is when the janitor is cleaning. There was a heaviness in the air that I could not quite put my finger on. Why was it impossible for me to call out to him and tell him that he had a letter waiting for him? I pushed the bathroom door open very gently, just in time to see Mr. Albert's entire body swell up and change shape. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't do that either. His clothes somehow melted into his body as he became green, standing with a posture of leaning forward, kind of like Godzilla, and he sprouted a long and spiked tail that was the color of raw sewage. His head, also elongated, became a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. It got worse. There was a boy in one of the stalls. Everything happened too fast for me to do anything or get anyone to point to the evidence. Just like that, the demon lizard that had been a teacher tore open the stall and tore the boy to shreds before he could even cry out. Blood splattering the walls and floor, and if I had been any further inside the bathroom, I would have gotten some of the blood on my face. Just as quickly, the monster lapped up the blood in movements far too quick for me to even follow. What should have transpired over the course of minutes happened in mere seconds. I ran away, heedless of however much noise I could have been making. I was beyond rational thought in that moment. It was true, fight or flight. I ran headlong into some other of the teachers. One of them, my own teacher, who had seen me in the halls, but didn't see me sit down for class. They weren't sure what to make of my hysterics. I was about to spill details about everything I had seen when Mr. Alberts was right there, behind me, when I turned around. His expression was so blank that I wasn't sure if he knew or not. But he eyed me for a long time, and I kind of shut down on the spot. I told my teacher later about what I had seen, but she did not buy it at all. I doubt she even shared the story with anybody. But from that day forward, I was never ever by myself at school. Not in the bathrooms, not in class, not in the hallways, not anywhere. And every time that Mr. Alberts saw me, he made eye contact firmly and held it. So yeah, it will be easy for anybody to write this off as a child's wild imagination. But I couldn't conceive of a kill that grisly and horrible on my own. That man, if he can even be called a man, was wandering the halls, looking for children that were by themselves so he could get a meal, and he could do the deed and clean up the evidence in a snap. And he somehow had everyone believing that he belonged in the building. What was he? I worked for an advertising agency based in a very small town. It's one of those things where it looked like a tornado took a business from downtown Manhattan and set it down someplace it most definitely didn't belong. But we got the business. We brought in professional traffic from outside of town, which helped other local businesses, including the ones we advertised for. I hired on as an intern and eventually got lumped in as a full-fledged copywriter. Our boss was a very strict, and yet somehow very likable, personable older man. We'll call him Max for the sake of this tale. Max wasn't one for small talk, and just about everything he said was straight to the point, nothing to add, which is the very nature of good advertising. But it was strange to see it in a man's everyday speech. Still, people seemed to like Max, and there was nothing about him that I personally had a problem with. Sort of. His eyes, though, they never seemed to focus. He always had that 1,000-yard stare that you associate with war veterans. But he had nothing in his office that would ever suggest that he served. His office didn't really have much of anything, really. It was probably after 3 years that I began to notice something. Close to winter, late autumn, when the cornfield behind the office building was very tall, I would notice something odd out in the middle of the field. At first, I thought it was a wildfire, but it never spread. I could tell that it was more like a campfire, very controlled and never getting out of hand. I wondered why anybody would have a campfire out in the middle of a cornfield. When the field was harvested, the fires stopped. But every single year, when the fields became tall, there were those fires, and they were in the same spot each and every time. I was about to bring this up in casual conversation when one evening, I noticed Max standing out back at the edge of the cornfield. I had assumed he was there having a smoke, but his hands never went to his mouth. He stood, staring at the field. I watched intently as he slowly walked into the field, swallowed up by the stalks that appeared to tower over him. Sure enough, a fire lit in the distance, in the remote heart of the field. After that, I noticed that the fires always came after Max went into the field. So whatever was up, he was in on it. I usually make very safe decisions, never wanting to risk making a bad career move. But my curiosity could not be contained. I simply had to know what a middle-aged advertising executive could possibly be up to at a fire in the butt crack of nowhere in a cornfield. I wondered if it was an exclusive little club for him and his closest colleagues. But he was the only one I ever saw leave the building for the field. Yeah, I couldn't take it. I brought my terrestrial telescope from home to work, and I waited. The harvest would be coming soon, so I would have only a few more chances to see what was truly happening in that field. The stalks blocked all but the hint of movement, intense movement, just over the tops of the stalks and leaves. There was no avoiding it. I would have to follow him into the field. I thought that I wasn't going to get the chance, but I did. You have no idea how hard it is to move quietly through a fully matured cornfield. It was more of a case of not being as noisy as Max, though he seemed to glide noiselessly through the stalks. But as he did, he also seemed to be changing before my very eyes. But I couldn't get more than a half a second of a visual on him. I didn't see the circular clearing until I had one thin row between it and me. Max stepped into the clearing with several other figures, and my blood ran cold. Max had transformed into something with a head as round as a bowling ball, but comprised mostly of a mouth with teeth like fine needles and small, glistening, coppery eyes. He honestly looked like a dinosaur, trying to be a human, complete with clawed and scaly fingers and a long, whipping tail. He picked up something like a ceremonial headdress, as did his other scaly companions, and they initiated a frenzied, frantic dance around a central fire. One of them broke away from the tornado of movement to pick up a book that looked like a gigantic, rotting dictionary. The movements of the others sped up, if anything, when the other creature began to read aloud. As his intonations became more fevered, so did the dancers. I lost track of which one was Max, since they all looked alike, except for maybe the colors of the iridescence of their scales. Something about the words made me feel lightheaded. It was a most strange experience. My body was reacting to the sound of speech when my mind was not. Other shapes were now appearing in the air around these lizard men. They were smoky and hazy, but becoming more solid. My instincts told me that I had to get out of there. I was so lightheaded that I felt like I was going to float away. I probably wasn't as careful as I should have been about making noise as I left the field, but I didn't care at the time. I got away, but the strange feeling persisted for a very long time. When I came into work the next day, I was called into Max's office, and he dismissed me from my job, citing lackluster quality of work, and even worse, work ethic. I won't lie, it kind of hurt, even though I knew the real reason why I was being shown to the door. I'm out of a job, and out of an explanation as to what exactly I witnessed. Were those other lizard creatures posing as important, high-level people in other places? I've only heard about reptilian shapeshifters on the internet. I never in my life could have imagined them being real as the air that you and I breathe.